At 3:20 am, on September 9, 1943, the first men of the 4th Ranger Battalion landed at the small beach in front of Maiori, west of Salerno, on the left flank of the main invasion zone. The Battle of Salerno has begun. It was also the beginning of one of the hardest campaigns of the Second World War, the Battle of Italy. Once ashore, facing no resistance, the Rangers moved 9 kilometers inland, while the remaining 2 battalions landed in the second wave shortly after. Within the hours, they completed their objective for the D-Day, seizing the high ground overlooking Maiori and the mountain passes to the north. At the same time, just a few kilometers down the coast, the first waves of the commandos approached the small port of Vitry. When the commandos made the final approach, they came under fire from a nearby coastal battery. The naval guns quickly silenced the German coastal battery, while the ships continued to lay down covering fire as commandos waded ashore. After the short combat in the streets of Vitry, they pushed the enemy garrison out of the village. With a Vitry secured, a second landing wave came ashore. The commandos moved inland, forming the defensive positions on the hills west of Salerno. During the morning, the Ranger patrols established contact with the commandos. The 2 groups of special forces secured their small bridgehead on the left flank. Around 4:30 am, the main 5th Army's assault began. In the British 10th Corps sector, the landing quickly descends into chaos. The 128th Brigade of the 46th Division landed in the first wave, on the beach designated as Uncle. To their right, the 169th Brigade of the 56th Division landed on the Sugar Beach, while further to the right, the 167th Brigade came ashore on the Roger Beach. By the time the 10th Corps divisions reached the shore, every element of surprise had long been gone. The German artillery batteries, positioned well behind the beaches, laid down a precise fire, guided by the well-placed forward observers, situated on the surrounding hills. To make matters worse, the night before the invasion, the Germans occupied the former Italian strongholds, codenamed Lilienthal and Moltke, placed just in front of the British landing beach. While the first assault waves, covered by naval gunfire, landed at designated sites, subsequent waves of infantry landed all over the place. Many units landed on the wrong beach, and found themselves on the wrong sides of the small rivers that ran through the landing area. 2 divisions became mixed up and pinned down by the artillery shelling and fire from the strong points. The engineers were not able to clear the mines. The progress stalled, and casualties mounted. It was not until 7 am, when the defenders from the strong points ran out of ammunition and withdrew, the advance continued. However, this was not the only setback the British would face on the first day. As the men of the 46th Division resumed their way to Salerno, they encountered a German mechanized column. In the battle that followed, the Germans completely destroyed the forward elements of the 128th Brigade, while the rest of them pulled back on the beach. The naval gunfire stopped the further German advance. On the right flank, the 56th Division made good progress, advancing across the Salerno plain, reaching the outskirts of Battipaglia and Montecorvino airfield, without much opposition. In the streets of Battipaglia, the reorganized Germans put a stiff resistance and stopped the further British advance. On Montecorvino Air Base, after a whole day of fighting, the nightfall brought the stalemate, with 2 sides holding both ends of the airfield, separated by a killing zone of the open runway. Except for the left flank, where the special forces spend the day fortifying their defenses, the results of the rest of the British 10th Corps day's fighting was disappointing, as they had failed to take most of its objectives set for the D-Day. Meanwhile, further south, in the sector of the 6th U.S. Corps, the Americans tried to achieve the surprise. The 36th Division landed without a preliminary naval bombardment. The first waves, with men of the 141st and 142nd Regiments, reached the designated beach, right on schedule at 3:30 am. However, as they landed in front of the ruins of Paestum, they were immediately pinned down by the German fire. The machine gun and artillery fire swept the entire beach, causing havoc as the subsequent waves of the landing ships arrived. It took hours for the Americans to secure the bridgehead, and only after the reserve 143rd Regiment reached the shore. Throughout the day, men of the 36th Division fought fiercely, repelling numerous German counterattacks. Supported by naval gunfire, by night, they reached the slopes of Monte Soprano. Although it didn't look like that at first, the Americans made good progress on the first day, almost completing all their objectives set for the D-Day. The German response was much faster, and their resistance was surprisingly heavier than the Allies expected. It was largely due to a prompt reaction of General Siekenius, who divided his 16th Panzer Division into several Kampfgruppen. The 16th Panzer Division Kampfgruppen, named after the commanding officer, consisted of various units. They were mostly a combination of divisions, tank or assault gun forces and infantry. General Siekenius splits his division into three main Kampfgruppen. On the north, Kampfgruppe Dornemann, under the command of Major Dornemann, held Salerno and its surroundings. Kampfgruppe under Oberst Sempel held Battipaglia, while the Kampfgruppe under Oberst von Holte fight Americans around Paestum. During the first day of the battle, the Allies seemed to be facing a much larger force. In reality, only one German division stood against the three Allied divisions. As night fell, the Germans withdrew from the northern and southern sectors of the invasion front, allowing the 46th Division to enter the deserted Salerno the following morning, and to take the city after skirmishes with German snipers. By nightfall, the 46th Division had established a defensive line on the hills surrounding the town, with the main strongpoint positioned on a hill overlooking Salerno, which would become known as Hospital Hill. The 6th Corps in the south used this relatively quiet day to expand its bridgehead. The 36th Division formed a new defensive line along the river Solefrun and secured Monte Soprano. The 45th Division began landing during the day and moved north to the River Selle to close 16 kilometers wide gap between the British and American forces. As the rest of the Fifth Army enjoyed a relatively quiet day, the 56th Division in the center was not so fortunate. Their day began with the German counterattack at Battipaglia. After bitter fighting, the 9th Battalion Royal Fusiliers, who were in the epicenter of attack, withdrew from Battipaglia with only 200 surviving men. Meanwhile, the 169th Brigade occupied the Montecorvino airfield that the Germans abandoned during the night. While at the same night, the reserve unit of the 56th Division, the 201st Guards Brigade, disembarked to support the 169th Brigade. At 7:30 am, the Guards Brigade launched an attack on a German-held strongpoint, known as the Tobacco Factory, just north of Battipaglia. The battle for Tobacco Factory lasted the whole day, and ended up with both sides still at the starting positions. Successes of the second day, and the lack of the German response, encouraged the Allies, who hoped that the worst was behind them. In fact, the Allies were unaware that the Germans had retreated to regroup, and awaited the arrival of reinforcements to launch the counterattack. Seeing what was going on, Field Marshal Kesselring ordered all of his available forces to rush into the Salerno area and throw the Allies back to sea. The German divisions began to pour towards the bridgehead. During the day, the first units of the Panzer Division Hermann Göring gather on the north. A paratrooper battalion, and troops of the 15th Panzer Division, reinforced Kampfgruppe Sempel in Battipaglia. The morning of the following day, September 11th, passed quietly. However, this silence was deceiving. It was only the calm before the storm, and when the storm came, the main blow fell on the British 46th Division, guarding the northern approaches to Salerno. At noon, after a brief artillery bombardment, the Germans launched an attack on the positions of the 139th Brigade. Kampfgruppe Dornemann, reinforced with a company of Stug 3 assault guns, attacked the British positions at Hospital Hill. While the newly formed Kampfgruppe Stroh consisted of the just-arrived units of the 15th Panzer Division, concentrated an attack on the northern approach to Salerno, around village Frat. On Hospital Hill, the 139th Brigade held its ground. With the help of a shell curtain of heavy naval guns, the British stopped the advance of Kampfgruppe Dornemann. Meanwhile, the attack of Kampfgruppe Stroh was more vigorous. The British defence of Frat, concentrated mainly on the bridge over the small river Erno, broke very quickly. The Germans, supported with armour, penetrated British defences with ease, and pushed them back into Salerno. Kampfgruppe Stroh continued to rage havoc at the northern outskirts of Salerno, only to be stopped by concentrated artillery fire. On the left flank, the Panzer Division Hermann Göring began to launch heavy probing attacks against well-prepared commando positions on the hills around Vitry. While the British 46th Division barely withstood the German attack in the hills north of Salerno, the 56th Division resumed the attack on the tobacco factory in the vicinity of Battipaglia. At first, the British made good progress until the early afternoon, when the Germans launched a major attack. Kampfgruppe Sempel, supported with two newly formed Kampfgruppes Kruger and von Dühring, stormed from Battipaglia and began to push the British out of their positions, almost totally destroying the 8th Battalion, Royal Fusiliers, on their way. By now, the 167th Brigade have already 2 out of its 3 battalions reduced on half strength. Again, the naval gunfire stops the German advance. The concentrated use of the big naval guns against the German attacks has become the leitmotif of the battle. It must have had a huge psychological impact for the Germans to see the wall of heavy naval shells exploding on the way of their advance. The bridgehead on the 10th Corps sector was far from secure. The thin British line barely withstood the fierce German attacks. As it was not enough, with the first daylight of September 12, Kampfgruppe Dornemann renewed the attack on Hospital Hill. The Germans swiftly overran the first British line. The close-quarter fighting on the hilltop and in the hospital building raged throughout the day, and when the night came, neither side remained in full control of the Hospital Hill. Just a few kilometers to the east, Kampfgruppe Stroh focused its attack on a hill right next to Salerno, known as the White House Hill, where the British sought refuge after being driven from the Frat the day before. The result was similar as on the Hospital Hill, and by the end of the day, the British had barely held out and kept the doorway of Salerno closed. After 2 days of bitter fighting, both sides had worn off and badly needed the rest. Further south, in the plains around Battipaglia, the stalemate continued. The 56th Division barely held its perimeter after suffering heavy casualties the previous day. The 167th Brigade suffered the most. The remnants of its 2 battalions, the 8th and the 9th Fusiliers Battalion, were joined together to form a composite force. As the day wore on, the anticipated German attack never came. In the evening, The British tried to use this silence, and the 201st Guards Brigade resumed the attack on the German strongpoint at the tobacco factory, the dominant point in the area. The Guards Brigade advanced over the open field, behind the artillery barrage. The German resistance was stiff. As the British troops approached the tobacco factory, the Germans launched an attack of their own. The attack penetrated the British right flank, and encircled the one entire Scots Guards Battalion company. The rest of the 201st Guards Brigade suffered heavy casualties, and pulled back to their starting positions, while the surrounded company surrendered to the Germans. At the same time, Kampfgruppe Sempel stormed out from Battipaglia to attack the positions of the battered 167th Brigade. After a short combat, the Germans pulled back to Battipaglia. The 4 days of fighting took a heavy toll on the 56th Division. The division barely held a thin line, and have lost almost all of its offensive capabilities. Meanwhile, in the south, the Americans continued to expand the bridgehead. During September 11, the 36th Division further enhanced their defensive positions, while the 142nd Regiment entered the deserted Altavilla, and formed the defensive line on the summit of Hill 424, just east of the village. The 45th Division continued to push towards the River Selly, a meeting point with the British 10th Corps. As they approached the village of Persano, they were suddenly attacked by the elements of the 29th Panzer Grenadier Division. In the attack, the 179th Regiment ended up surrounded. The bitter fight lasted the whole afternoon. During the night, the Germans withdrew from Persano, which allowed forward elements of the 45th Division to make contact with the encircled 179th Regiment. Although intelligence reports suggested that the Germans were building the forces for a major attack at the 45th Division sector, General Troy Middleton, the 45th Division commanding officer, wanted to exploit the Germans' withdrawal from Persano. He decided to attack the tobacco factory near Fiocche, which controlled the bridge across the River Selly. On the morning of September 12, the 157th Regiment, supported with tanks, began the assault on the tobacco factory. After a series of attacks and counterattacks throughout the day, the factory changed hands multiple times, and at the end of the day, it remained under American control. At the same time, the 36th Division went through an ordeal of its own. Before the dawn of September 12, the Germans infiltrated American positions on top of the Hill 424, and at first daylight, they launched the surprise attack from both flanks, surrounding the American battalion on the hilltop. Shortly after the attack, the German artillery began pounding the hill. The 2nd Battalion of the 142nd Regiment remained encircled and pinned down in their foxholes for the rest of the day. Except around Battipaglia, there was no clear front line in the Salerno plain. The Germans did not form a defensive line. They were grouped into Kampfgroups, and during the night, they would retreat into surrounding hills to rearm and regroup. During the day, they would carefully choose where to launch the attack. On the other side, the Allies were on the offensive. They would dig in for the night, forming only the modest defensive positions, consisting mostly of slit trenches. Lack of proper defense will cost the Allies dearly. The new day, September 13, began with an attempt of the 36th Division to rescue the surrounded battalion atop of Hill 424. The remaining 2 battalions of the 142nd and elements of the 143rd Regiment began with an approach to Hill 424. The 142nd Regiment pushed its way from Hill 423. Halfway to Hill 424, the German resistance stopped their advance. In the afternoon, a spirited German counterattack forced them to pull back on Hill 423. The attack of the 143rd Regiment was more successful. In the afternoon, after heavy fighting, the elements of the 143rd Regiment reached Altavilla and re-established contact with the isolated battalion. After the successful evacuation of the remnants of the 2nd Battalion, in the afternoon, the Germans attacked the Americans, still holding Altavilla. The attack broke the American line, and the men of the 143rd Regiment began to run, fleeing down the hillside. In all of this chaos, the K Company of the 3rd Battalion still held its ground at Altavilla. By the end of the day, the K Company was driven back into a corner of the village, and surrounded. The isolated company would eventually surrender the following morning. Anyhow, the ordeal of the 143rd Regiment was far from over. By September 13, against the 4 divisions of the Fifth Army, the Germans had assembled forces, formed of elements of 5 divisions. Now, as the bulk of the 29th Panzergrenadier Division arrived in the Salerno area, the Germans were ready for the final push to the sea. The main attack was to go along the River Selle, where the Germans wanted to exploit the gap still open between the Allied forces. In the early afternoon, the Germans threw everything they had on the positions of the 45th Division, in the final attempt to push the Allies into the sea. The attack began, with Kampfgruppe Stempel launching pinning attacks against the thin line held by the 56th Division, taking village Santa Lucia on the way. At the same time, the German began with artillery shelling on the positions of the 45th Division. After a while, the tanks rushed over the open field towards the American lines. Kampfgruppe von Düring, of the 16th Panzer Division, advanced on the right flank of the attacking force, towards the tobacco factory near Foch. On the left, the newly formed Kampfgruppe Kleiner Limburg assaulted Persano, and next to them, Kampfgruppe Kruger, a part of the 29th Panzergrenadier Division, advanced down the Selle. The Germans penetrated the American line in several places. The Persano and tobacco factory have been taken. The seriousness of the situation forced General Middleton to order anyone who could carry a rifle to hold the line. The mechanics, cooks, truck drivers, headquarters staff, and artillery personnel all took part in the combat. The Germans used the collapse of the 45th Division to swing aside and outflank the exposed 2nd Battalion of the 143rd Regiment. Pressured from the two sides, the 2nd Battalion soon ended up surrounded and destroyed, losing 508 men killed or captured in less than 30 minutes. Again, it was the artillery fire that stopped the attack. By night, the Germans lost the momentum and pulled back. Meanwhile, on the far north, after the probing attack previous days, the Hermann Göring divisions, Kampfgruppe Fitz, launched an assault on the hills above Vitry, using the early morning mist as a cover. After fierce combat, the commandos were eventually driven back to the outskirts of Vitry, where they formed a defensive line. After a furious artillery barrage, the Germans stopped the attack, short of the fishing village, and pulled back. The commandos used the German withdrawal, and by 2:30 p.m., the hill was back in the British hands, but the cost had been high. The commandos lost 120 men, almost a quarter of the remaining force. By now, the Fifth Army's situation on the bridgehead was critical. All Army's divisions suffered heavy casualties, and neither one was in the possibility to advance any further. The fate of the bridgehead hung on a thread. General Mark Clark even considered the evacuation. However, he decided to hold the bridgehead. He ordered divisions in the Salerno plain to pull back, shrink the line, and move into the defense. That night, the men of the Fifth Army spent fortifying the line. The newly arrived elements of the 751st Tank Battalion and the 636th Tank Destroyer Battalion reinforced the line. Clark even called upon his strategic reserve, the U.S. 82nd Airborne Division, based in Sicily. During the night, the 504th Regiment, the 82nd Airborne Division, made the parachute drop on the bridgehead. While 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 504th Regiment landed safely behind American lines, the 3rd Battalion was scattered all over the Salerno plain. On the morning of September 14, the Germans resumed their offensive. But now, they faced well-prepared American positions. The German attack, on the line held by the 179th Regiment, supported by tanks and anti-tank guns, was repelled with ease. In the afternoon, Germans launched a couple more attacks on the American-held line. All German attacks ended the same. The time when Germans freely roamed around Salerno plain was now over. American defenses were too strong for the Germans to break. While the Americans firmly held their line, the crisis in the North Sector continued. The Kampfgruppe Stroh, after spending the previous day resting and rearming, resumed with the attack on the White House Hill. The fierce attack overrun the British positions and threw the defenders back to the outskirts of Salerno. The loss of the White House Hill meant that German artillery observers now had a clear view of the British landing beach, and could call down artillery fire wherever they liked. By September 15, the Germans realized they had lost the opportunity to push the Allies into the sea. The fresh units of the 7th Armored Division began to disembark on the Salerno bridgehead, reinforcing the 10th Corps. The 504th Regiment of the 82nd Airborne Division reinforced the 6th Corps sector. Furthermore, the 13th Corps of the 8th British Army rapidly approached the bridgehead. With newly arrived troops, the tide has turned. The Germans launched one final assault on September 16, in the area around Battipaglia. This time, they were met by the tanks of the 7th Armored Division, who quickly pushed them back into the village. All these days, a combination of artillery fire and naval gunnery played a crucial role in stopping the German attacks. This firepower came at a price. During the battle, the ships in the confined waters of the Gulf of Salerno were under constant air attack. Despite being covered by the air cover provided by the support carrier force and the planes based in Sicily, the Luftwaffe successfully damaged 2 cruisers and sunk 1 hospital ship. The most serious naval casualty was the battleship HMS Warspite, hit by a new German weapon, the Fritz X glide bomb, on September 15. The most of September 16, the Allies used to renew the offensive, as the Germans did not show any ambition for further attacks. Instead, the Germans relied mainly on the artillery fire. The last fighting took place on September 17. While trying to retake the hill, 424 men of the 504th Regiment, the 82nd Airborne Division, came under German attack, which stopped the American advance. While the British tried to push the Germans from the White House Hill, in the vicinity of Salerno. On the morning of September 18, the Allies prepared for yet another day of fighting. As the troops moved to take their objectives, they discovered that the Germans evaporated from the battlefield. The German withdrawal began as early as the afternoon of September 17. First, they broke contact with the 6th Corps on the south, and continued northward to take the position behind the river Volturno, north of Naples. Behind them, they left only a small rear guard, in the area between Salerno and Naples, to slow down the British advance until the engineers complete the destruction of Naples port facilities. The victory at Salerno was the costly one. The Allies lost 2,129 killed, 7,365 men wounded, and an astonishing 4,099 missing in action. The German lost 840 men killed, 2,002 wounded, and 603 missing. The bloody Battle of Salerno was just an introduction to the hard battles yet to come.